Professor, Professor, sorry, I believe you're muted.
Excuse me, Professor. Professor? Oh no.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we
Oh, for
can.
Christ's sake. I'm repeating what I was dealing with was the decline of the Roman Empire. That question, that's what I'm dealing with. So I'm going to pick that up at that point. And basically what I said, well, what I was trying to say was, in answering this question, you want to stress over exploitation of the population through taxes, excessive rents, too much work. The population became vulnerable, and things were made worse by the internal civil wars and the barbarian invasions of the 3rd century. The net result was a dramatic decline in population. 1/3 of the population disappeared, especially the slaves who maintained the infrastructure of the empire. They could not easily be replaced. And as a consequence of these factors, there was a decline of the cities and commerce. And of course, the political unity of the empire was based on the market economy. Well, the market economy basically withered. The cities withered. And the elites fled the cities and went into the countryside and established themselves in their villas with their dependent peasants and slaves. And consequently, the foundations of political unity were lost. You should add that this happened in both the East and the West, but the East was more resilient, and so it survived. And in this respect, you should note that Diocletian and Constantine, with their reforms, they temporarily saved the empire. But in the end, at the end of the 5th century, the second wave of barbarian invasions destroyed the Roman Empire in the East. Are there any questions about this number 30 that I've gone through? Okay, let's move to the narrative. And what this lecture I'm going to entitle The Papal Monarchy. The Papal Monarchy, because what it's really about is the fact that in this period of the High Middle Ages, the church is the central institution, and at the head of the church, the Roman papacy, which not only did it lead the great sort of religious movements within the church, but it developed its own political agenda. In fact, the powerful popes of this period basically attempted to politically dominate the secular emperors and kings during this period. There was a veritable attempt to establish a kind of pan-European papal state, if you like. And that's, I think, the main thrust of what I have to say today. But to begin with, I would note that, or to go back to some of the things I was saying earlier in the last lecture, with the death of Charlemagne, of course, we see a resurgence of anarchy, violence, the breakdown of political authority, and the church itself became basically caught up in this. The churches were isolated from one another. They, in fact, the bishops and the abbots, to save themselves and their institutions, basically took overlords and became part of the feudal system. The church was an integral part, from this point onwards, an integral part. A bishop was also a feudal lord. This is the way it worked. And as a result of all this, there was corruption, rampant corruption in the church. Nobody was really supervising anything. And basically the bishoprics and the great monasteries became the playthings of the feudal aristocracy. The big families tried to control the bishoprics and the monasteries. They wanted to install their own nephews, their own cousins as bishops or as abbots, because the churches by this point were rich institutions. And so it enhanced the power of these aristocratic families to have bishops and abbots among their relations. And we can see this clearly in the case of Rome, Rome itself, the papacy. Now, in and around Rome, there were big landed families. And the papacy became a kind of plaything between these families. Which family would name the Pope? Which family would the Pope come from? And as a consequence, there were bribes, corruption, all kinds of hanky-panky of various kinds that went on. And certainly there was both, there were things like murder, violence, and the complete loss of any sense of the spiritual mission of the church. Now, the source of reform eventually came with the overall revival that came about in Europe in at the end of the 10th century. Peace returns, a certain level of peace and so on, a certain level of stability, commerce, merchants, money. This is all very important in terms of the economic underlay of what's going on. But in terms of the reform of the church, the first initiative came from the Order of Cluny, which I mentioned last time. Right up here. Remember, I said at the beginning of the 10th century, 909, an attempted revival of the Benedictine order. This was, monastery was founded in northern Burgundy, and this monastery attempted to revive the rule of Saint Benedict based on poverty, chastity, and obedience. It attempted to revive monastic learning. It, in terms of the religious life, it centered its religious life around the Mass, or as it's called to this day, the Opus Dei in Latin, the Mass. And the monks would spend hours adoring the cross on their knees at Mass. And this eventually took on a very elaborate form, this centrality of the Opus Dei. At the same time, the piety of these monks, at least initially, attracted all kinds of gifts from the kings, from the feudal aristocrats, and soon the order of the monastery of Cluny and the monasteries that associated themselves with Cluny, the Cluniac order, if you like, began to become very rich. And the abbots of these monasteries became politically extremely close to the kings. They became advisors. They specialized in political advice to the monarchy. They were highly political. Now, the thing about this order was that the abbot of Cluny was not only the head of the monastery of Cluny, he was the head of the whole order, in the sense that he sent out inspectors every year to make sure that the other monasteries, and soon they were scores, if not hundreds, of these monasteries, conformed to the Benedictine rule. So the essence of the reform was this notion of a kind of league of monasteries, an order of monks who were all under the abbot of Cluny, who's the head of the order, and maintained discipline over the whole order. However, as I have explained, these people became so rich that by the middle of the 11th century, they basically, after 150 years, they themselves became corrupt as a result of their great wealth and their involvement in politics. And so you see a new reform movement, emerges, and this is the order of the Cistercians. Near Cluny, there's another, in a more remote area, there's a place called Citeaux. And so this monastery, this order of monks call themselves Cistercians after Citeaux. Well, what the Cistercians, they compared themselves to the Cluniacs, and they said that the Cluniacs had accepted all kinds of land, jewelry, gold from the kings, from the feudal aristocracy. They had become corrupt as a result. So we're going to base our monasteries on our own efforts. The Cistercians are really the first of the order of monks in the Middle Ages to actually, these are noblemen to begin with. They go out into the remote areas, into the wastelands, into the great forests, and they build their monasteries, and they refuse to accept any gifts. They work with their hands, and they attempt to take their distance from patronage from the feudal aristocracy or from the kings. And at the same time, they practice certainly they're highly ascetic. That is to say, they're not into food, drink, making merry, etc. They're constantly practicing this austerity, and they, instead of concentrating on the mass, their whole thing is private meditation, individual meditation, as against the practice of the mass. What I find interesting about this, I'm not really a religious person, but I would say it's interesting to study religion. And there are all kinds of ways of practicing religion. You can emphasize ritual and liturgy, as the Cluniacs did, or here you have the Cistercians with their private devotions and so on. And there are all sorts of other ways in which religion can be practiced. And it's interesting how inventive people are in terms of their approach to religion. So the most important individual to emerge from the Cistercian movement was a guy was of noble birth. His name was Bernard, a Frenchman, and ultimately he was canonized by the church, was made into a saint, so we call him Saint Bernard. And Saint Bernard was absolutely exemplary as a Cistercian. He was extremely austere. He scarcely ate anything. He was deeply into private meditation, but at the same time, he turned out to be a tremendous preacher. He's the first really great preacher in Western Christendom. A great preacher, of course, preaching repentance and so on, repent for your sins and all that, but also now calling for crusades to liberate the Holy Land. St. Bernard has a lot to do with the early crusading movement. So he took the lead in sort of promoting the crusades, which I have explained in the last class. But the last and in the long term, the most interesting from both a religious and a political point of view is that St. Bernard insisted that the church is above the state. The church is above the secular world. And indeed, St. Bernard plays a big role in the revival of the authority of the Roman popes, which is, of course, as I said, very important in terms of the overall movement of the High Middle Ages. Now, I've already mentioned that at the beginning of discussing the High Middle Ages, I talked about the economic background, and I said that the growth of agriculture, the agrarian growth of the period, and the rise of the cities and towns are extremely important. They're important in their own right, but in explaining the ability of the church to become so powerful. The towns, the cities, money plays a huge role in the providing the means for unifying, for centralizing the church. But the same thing is true of the secular kingdoms and states that also begin to develop in this period. It's the merchants, the money, the towns, which more and more become, from an economic point of view, central, and they become the foundations, if you like, for both the growth of the church, but also now the growing power of the monarchies at the same time. So before I get to the revival of the papacy, I want to note that, yes, the church, these new orders are interesting. This is the development of the Cistercians. And as you'll see later on, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, it's based on this economic foundation. But in particular, at this point, I want to stress the emergence of the powerful states that begin to emerge. And when we talk about powerful states, the most important is France. In this period, you see France had been notable under the Merovingians, and especially under Charlemagne. But now France reemerges as the single most powerful monarchy, this time based on feudalism, but also based on the fact that this feudal system of lordship, of overlordship, and so on, is backed up by commercial activity, the market, and money. The two together are what makes political power during the High Middle Ages and during this whole period from about 1000 to 1500. So France is the most important. And I've already explained that in the 10th century, the 9th and 10th century, France was divided, the Vikings and so on. Everything was decentralized, power devolved to the local level, and I named 6 or 7 great lordships, from the Counts of Flanders to the Dukes of Burgundy, to the Dukes of Normandy, to the Counts of Toulouse. The country was divided up. But I said that the Duchy of France, which was centered on the so-called Ile-de-France, Paris, and the rich agriculture surrounding Paris, that was the most important, because the Duke of France, Hugh Capet, inherited the monarchy. The empire had basically moved to Germany, but there was still the title King of France still existed. And the Dukes of France, now in the middle of the 10th century, became kings of France. They ruled only over the Ile-de-France. But in the next century, in the 11th century, we see that these kings of France consolidate their control over the Ile-de-France, and they begin to conquer the adjacent feudal territories. The feudal lords who exist in the immediate area next to the Ile-de-France are forced to pay homage to the King of France. The next step comes in the 12th and 13th centuries with precisely the emergence of towns and commerce and a merchant class is the real, the full emergence of royal power, because in the second half of the 12th century, there is a king in France. His name is Philip Augustus. Philip Augustus. And it is Philip Augustus who basically brings all of the feudal lords in northern France under his control, either directly or indirectly. All of the, up until this point, they've been independent. They haven't had to answer to the king. But Philip Augustus basically consolidates the feudal system under his control at the end of the 13th, at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century. And for good measure, sorry, in the 13th century. And for good measure, he's followed by another king, Louis IX, who is otherwise known as Saint Louis, St. Louis, Saint Louis, who basically conquers southern France. Southern France, under Louis IX, is added to northern France. And at this point, you have, certainly it's a feudal decentralized system still. It's not, they don't have a fully developed bureaucracy, but with the money given to them by the merchants, they are able to sort of organize the feudal system and put themselves centrally at the top of that system by the end of the 13th century. And I would say that this powerful French monarchy becomes the example for other would-be kings in Western Europe. It becomes a kind of model state. And so it has an importance beyond itself. Now, I've already mentioned, just to complete the picture, I'm going to look at the case of England and the case of Germany. What happens in England? Well, we know it's already happened. 1066, William the Conqueror conquers the Anglo-Saxons, and he sets up a fully integrated feudal system under himself. And the fact that the towns in England, especially London, but other towns as well, are reviving the merchant class and money is reviving, reinforces the power of the English monarchy in the 11th and 12th century. It gets stronger and stronger, just like France, although it's not as powerful as is the French monarchy. So that's what happens in the case of England. Now, in the case of Germany, the situation is different, and it's quite important. The difference is very important because we know that Germany, that's where the Holy Roman Emperor was. The title had gone basically to the German king, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Emperors of the 11th and 12th century were trying to do exactly what the English kings and the French kings were successfully doing. That is to say, setting up a feudal monarchy with a strong feudal monarchy, which, with the help of the merchant class and the church, would be comparable to what had been accomplished in France and in England. But this was not to be, because we see that, first of all, the forces of disunity were very strong in Germany. There was a persistent tribalism in Germany. Remember, that was where the barbarians came from, and the barbarian localism, the different tribes that continued to exist in Germany, resisted this process of integration. The nobles, in short, were resisting. But the most important problem was the fact that the German emperors were so dependent on the Catholic Church, on the bishops, the archbishops, the abbots. They depended, certainly the King of France and the King of England depended on the church as well. It was an important buttress. But in Germany, the church was central to the attempt on the part of the monarchy to consolidate a centralized feudal state, I would call it. But at this point, it ran into the fact that at the same time as the emperors were trying to do this, a rival power emerges, and that is the growing power of the Roman papacy. And the Roman papacy had serious reservations about the consolidation of a strong centralized German state or a strong centralized emperor in Germany, because these emperors not only claimed to rule over Germany, but they also claimed to dominate Italy as well. And the popes, as I have explained before, had become and were becoming increasingly powerful political figures, especially in central Italy. And they were very wary of the consolidation of a strong German monarchy. And so they set themselves and they set the church, the German church. They told the bishops, they told the abbots to, when the emperor appealed for support, the church withheld its support. And as a result, a great struggle broke out between the popes and the Holy Roman emperors. And the result of this struggle was the failure of the German process of centralization to complete itself successfully. Germany failed to become an integrated feudal state. Instead, it became a decentralized German state, largely on account of papal opposition. And Of course, this became a permanent condition. Germany never did become a centralized state until the 19th century. Another feature of this is the popes basically were content and supported the growing independence of the Italian cities. The Italian cities nominally were supposed to be under the Holy Roman Emperor. And, but the popes, in order to protect their own independence, basically supported the independence of the Italian towns. And these towns, which were the most prosperous, economically the most powerful towns in Christendom, now, as a result of this struggle between emperor and popes, they became politically independent, just as did the papacy. And this also, of course, meant that Italy never really did become unified until the 19th century, but also it set the stage for a great new cultural movement, which we might get to, we might be able to discuss in time. I'm talking about the Italian Renaissance, but that's a later story. What I want to talk about now is how did the popes become so powerful? How did papal power grow? Well, I would say that the Cistercians, Saint Bernard, but also the Cluniacs, they began more and more to support the idea that the church has to have a strong leader. And they were the ones who were instrumental in the first instance in promoting the revival of the papacy. And the first important reform pope, his name was Leo IX, and I give you his dates, 1048 to 54. Now, what did Leo IX do? He basically promoted the idea that the kings, the emperor, and the local feudal nobility should have nothing to do with the offices of the church, that bishops and abbots should be named by members of the church, by Rome, or by local clergy. They should be, the bishops and the abbots should be elected within the church, and the feudal aristocracy, the kings and the emperors, should keep their hands off the structure of the church. Insofar as the local churches look to authority, they should look to Rome. And Leo began to assert this. He held a whole series of conferences, or we can call them synods of the church, in order to enforce this new approach of basically divorcing the institutional structure of the church from the feudal pyramid that I've mentioned, and for control by the secular political elites. And this initial endeavor was intensified by a successor pope. A few years later, we have another even stronger pope by the name of Gregory VII, 1073 to 85. Gregory the Seventh, who he makes a series of pronouncements in which he basically says, you know, not only should the church be independent, should look to Rome and be independent of the secular rulers, the emperors and the kings and the various dukes and counts and so on. But I assert, based on my study of the Bible and of the text of the church, that in fact, the church is superior to the all secular political authorities. And within this church, the popes are the absolute rulers. He basically asserts the absolute monarchy of the Roman popes over the over Christendom. At the end of the day, um, the um, these secular rulers are subordinate to the Pope. And I'm just quoting this now. This is from Gregory the Seventh. This is what he says in 1075, quote, unquote, "The Roman pontiff alone is rightly to be called universal. He alone can depose and reinstate bishops. He alone may use the imperial insignia. The Pope is the only one whose feet are to be kissed by all princes. He may depose emperors. He may transfer bishops. He may himself be judged by no one. The Roman Church has never fallen into error. He should not be considered as Catholic who is not in conformity with the Roman Church. The Pope may absolve subjects of unjust men from their fealty." In other words, the popes are not merely rulers over the church, they rule over all of the states, including the emperor, the king of England, the king of France, and so on. And believe it or not, in the following years, the popes nearly got away with it. They nearly established themselves as the effective rulers over Western Europe. This particular Pope, Gregory the Seventh, got into, this had already begun earlier, but he got into a huge struggle with the German emperor. His name was Henry IV. And the German emperor, Henry IV, became so furious that he basically tried to remove Gregory the Seventh, willy-nilly, from the papal throne. Well, Gregory, not only did he excommunicate this emperor, but he told the German nobility, who were more than prepared to listen, and the German bishops and abbots have nothing to do with Henry IV. And Gregory was successful. The nobility in the church in Germany deserted the emperor and looked to Gregory. And Henry only was able to get away, was able to survive by kissing the feet of Gregory the Seventh. He had to come and abase himself and kiss the Pope's feet. This was one of the more dramatic moments in the rise of the papal monarchy. But we see another instance in the case of England. There was a powerful king, as Henry II was his name. And this is the man following William the Conqueror, who basically developed the basic institutions of the English monarchy, including the sheriffs, trial by jury, the early stages of the parliament in England. They're all the creations of Henry II. Well, he tried to control the church. Well, the church was under the control of Rome, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leading ecclesiastic in England, when the king told him to do something, he said, "No, I will not do it because it goes against the commands of the popes in Rome." And he stubbornly refused the king's orders. So Henry told a few of his knights, "Will you get rid of this guy?" And so at the orders of Henry II, Thomas Becket was murdered right in the Cathedral of Canterbury by the orders of the king. And this is in 1171. Well, the whole of the English church and indeed much of the nobility rebelled against Henry II, and basically Henry was obliged to submit to the papacy. And indeed, the successor of Henry II, the person who succeeded him, a king known as King John, this is John the Bad, you know, Robert Hood and Bad King John. Well, John the Bad. Well, the offensive by the papacy continued to the point where John the Bad was forced actually to become the feudal vassal. That is to say, the whole of the Kingdom of England became a fief that's under the control, political control of the Roman popes. These are just two examples of what was happening all across Christendom. We see that this culminates in the pontificate of Innocent III, who brings the papal monarchy to its height, to its highest stage. He's the one who forced John the Bad to become vassal, but he also made vassals of the King of Hungary, the King of Poland, and the King of Castile. All became vassals of the Roman papacy under Innocent III. And in terms of the politics of France, the politics of Germany were all controlled by Innocent the Third. And to cap this off, he is the guy who basically created this had been in the works for some time, but Innocent III creates a powerful centralized bureaucracy in Rome, which now makes it possible for the papal state to become a real state. He's able to collect revenues. And finally, Innocent III founds two new religious orders. I have mentioned the Benedictines, I've mentioned the Cluniacs, I mentioned the Cistercians. The two last and most famous important orders were the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who came into existence under the patronage of Innocent III. Now, who were the Dominicans? The Dominicans are named after Saint Dominic. He was a Spaniard. And their specialty was preaching and teaching. They were educators, they were preachers. They took the vow, they took the Benedictine vow, but the thing that distinguished them and distinguished the Franciscan was that instead of going out into the countryside and living in these remote monasteries, the Dominicans and the Franciscans worked in the cities. The cities were becoming more and more important, and they were neglected from a spiritual point of view. There was heresy, there was ignorance. The Dominican, from a Catholic point of view, the Dominicans were great teachers, but they were also great persecutors because they founded the Roman Inquisition to chase heretics. Now, the Franciscans were very different. They worked in the cities. They also took the vows. They were named after an Italian, St. Francis, but they were very different. They didn't stress rational argument and so on. St. Francis was a great religious figure, I would say almost second to Jesus himself. His life was exemplary. And what they taught was the simple and direct piety and charity of St. Francis as an example for everybody else. So that was the Franciscan order. I'll finish this in the next class. Sorry we had this screw up at the beginning.